So my main goal when it comes to reviewing on the final review is to make sure I haven't missed anything. So I have a list that covers every subject on the final exam. I'm not giving you that in writing, but I will walk through that list in my head as I'm standing up here talking to you, and I will work from notes that I've prepared to make sure I don't miss any subjects. I find with returning adult students that rather than hand you a 600-page book and say, good luck, see you next week, that people's studies will be better if I give you targeted areas. Hence this breakdown that says, look, chapter 14 is a place to spend time, not chapter 1. You know, at least gives you a sense of what material to pour over. So it's kind of a combination of things. You've got these two documents, give you a list of terms, which is longer than you really need, but I'm not going to give you only those terms. And then an approximation of which chapters the test questions come from, and then that comprehensive review. I think it's pretty thorough. I don't see that there will be any other way. Because the one thing the law prevents me from doing is giving you the questions or giving you the answers. But I can get as close to that as I think is academically appropriate. And I think you'll have a fair shot. Any other questions about anything before we get on with last chapter?
So we have one chance to take the test for
Correct. You should plan on that being the case.
For the state. If
Yes,
we
right. Pass this, the state gives you 4 opportunities. You have to pay for each one of those opportunities, you know, $46 a piece, whatever, but the state gives you 4. Yeah. And that's, you know, again, that's something I've been arguing here for a number of years, but colleges don't typically do that. You know, so it's a credit course. So again, if it turns out that you don't pass, you know, talk to me and we'll see if there's any options by then. But it's too soon. I don't think there's any way I would have anything submitted to the state, much less approved. Ray, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you already answered this, but are there going to be any questions on the exam that you didn't put into the practice quizzes?
Into the practice quizzes, maybe, yes. I mean, in terms of the 4 paper ones that I sent you with?
Yeah.
Yeah. Those practice quizzes are multifold. So I'll tell you why I created them. I used to teach, when I first started teaching pre-license, I've almost always taught at colleges. I taught at a school that gave 4 unit tests as part of the grade, and they had separate, you could get an academic grade, which was separate from your ability to pass. So students could get an A in the course and still not pass for the state exam. We don't do that here. Wavansi wants one set of, you know, you passed, and it should line up with the grade. Well, as you say, so what happened was that school, while I was still teaching there part-time, stopped giving those unit tests. And what happened was, all of a sudden, the final exam scores went way down. Because what was happening was people weren't getting feedback. They didn't really know how they were. They thought they were really doing really well. Then they were scoring in the 60th percentile on the final because they weren't as prepared. So the main reason for those paper tests that I've given you is to self-assess, to have a better sense of, oh my God, I'm only getting half of these right. Oh, I'm doing great, I'm getting 9 out of 10. The second thing I've been able to do with those over the years, and I haven't changed them now for about 2 years, is as I see questions that I really find important on the final, that maybe I'm not covering adequately in the class or get glossed over or need one more bit of reinforcement, some of the questions that are embedded in those 4 unit tests are what I would like to refer to as twins to questions that will be on the final. But it's only a handful. If you only study those 200 questions, you will have studied far too little for the final. Maybe there's 20 questions out of those 200 that you'll recognize, and they're there because that's the best way that I've found to make sure that people are actually have seen that material or heard it or whatever once before. So it's a combination of things. And other than the question I told you about regarding transfer taxes that we went over, municipal transfer taxes, there should be nothing on the final that we haven't specifically talked about and or that you haven't seen. It's in the book or it's been in my lectures or both. And say in the municipal transfer tax, those 3 questions, what's the rate, who pays, is there any, what's the rate, who pays. That one question that relates to that specific detail is only in my lecture, not in the book. Everything else should be in both, or at least in the book.
So if we study the quizzes at the end of every single chapter in the book, we should be fine then?
Yeah, that's where I would start. Make sure you know that material well. You look at those the paper tests I've given you. The students who do the absolute best on the final are also the ones typically who tell me they take the online practice quizzes over and over and over again. Okay. All I can tell you is that my experience is both as an instructor And as a student who's been through 5 different multiple choice type real estate licensing exams in various states, always successfully, is that the best way to prepare for taking a multiple choice test is to take multiple choice test questions as practice. I know of no better way. I literally almost got into a shouting match with the prior director of the Bureau of Real Estate with IDFPR when I, pointed out how important it was that we teach students and give them a chance to practice in the same way that they're being tested, because it matters. So you can know the material really well, but if you don't think well in multiple choice format, you might not do as well as you want. So it's important to be able to do both.
Did you have 4 tests, you said?
Me, I've taken 5 different. Personally?
Oh, you have, yeah.
Yeah.
I know, I meant for here, you said you had 4. You only
Yeah.
had 2.
Well, you haven't gotten, I've given you 3, right? There's one more, one more to come. Well, I should have given you one more tonight, shouldn't I? I forgot about that. If you guys want to wait like 5 minutes afterwards, I can run up and print them and collate them and bring them down. There's one more unit test through this chapter. Totally forgot. Sorry about that.
That's good.
Focused on all this stuff and get to it. Yeah, so I've given you, we'll have given you 4 once I give you that. In fact, maybe I can even print them from here, but it'll generate a lot of ozone in back.
Yes, he said, and he's got 1 more.
You should have had 3 so far, right?
No.
There's 1 through 6, 7 through 10, 11 through 14.
We didn't get that one.
You never got 11 through 14? You have 3? Yeah, no, it was here. It was quite a while ago. There was 1 week when I gave you one, and then a week later I gave you another one because it was fairly short. Because there was so the one that had 11 through 14 came a week later. So yeah, I definitely had those. I forgot about the one for tonight. It's been so long. Well, I can also post that up online. I can also put all that information up online.
That would be great.
Yeah, can do that now that everybody's gone through material. But I'll try to remember to do those tonight before we get out of here. Other questions?
So, on the state class, when there's that section, Illinois and the rest of the country, how hard is it?
To know which you're in?
Variation,
Oh.
between Illinois and the rest of the country?
All I can tell you is when you sit with this, when I'm involved in a test question writing scenario with the state and with AMP, the testing company, it's clearly defined, this is a national test question writing assignment, or this is an Illinois test question writing assignment. So when we're told to bring questions, we know we're writing questions that are meant to apply to 12 or 14 different states, and it has to be a universal question, or this is Illinois specific. So we know which is which. It's 2 separate databases, and they keep track of that. They keep it separate. And every test question not only goes in front of our group of instructors to write them, but it's vetted by AMP. Then it goes eventually to the state licensing authority, and they vet every question on both the national and the state portion of their test. And occasionally a question will get passed by 12 out of 13 states and bounced by 1 because our state works differently, and then that question doesn't make it onto the national portion of the test. So all that stuff is pretty sorted out. I know of nobody who has ever come back to me and said, boy, there was this question, I really wish I knew if it was Illinois or national. I know, again, I've personally taken 5 different tests in 2 different states, and I've never seen that as an issue. So I wouldn't worry about that at all. You have to know what the Illinois concerns are, particularly as it relates to the license law. And again, I see no pattern. Some students who go and pass one portion or pass the other, for some they pass Illinois and don't pass the national, some pass the national and don't pass Illinois. I don't see a pattern there amongst my students either. So, just do the best with both parts and go there and see how it goes. I had last semester, I think it was, I had a class where I had 2 college professors as students in my class. Tell me that isn't a little bit interesting. And I had a few traditional students as well. So one of the traditional students who barely passed the test to get through the course passed the state exam, both parts, first time. One of the college professors had to go twice. There's just no way for me to know who's going to pass and who's not. I just have no idea. Any other questions? Steve, go ahead.
I have one, it's probably been talked about, sponsoring broker. When you take the state test, do you have to have the sponsoring broker then, or?
No. You do not have to know who your sponsoring broker is at all. Just keep in mind you have a year. A passing score is good for 1 year. So once you have passed both portions, you only have 1 year until that passing score expires. So within that 1 year, you have to go get signed up, or you have to go take the state exam again, and you are, and now have reduced attempts at passing. So that's the only real reason to know who your sponsoring broker is going to be before you take the test, so that you can get signed up fairly quickly. But you have no obligation of any kind, nor do you need to have a sponsor until after you have passed the state exam.
One more question.
Go ahead.
My intention is to do this after I'm retired in 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
Can I just keep a sponsoring broker, because I have some conflict of interest, I can't be selling real estate while I'm doing this other job.
Yeah, yeah. So what you want to do there is you want to talk to brokerage firms about whether they have a holding company. A holding company will be a related firm that has a sponsoring broker. It's a licensed brokerage firm, but they won't let you do any business. All they will allow you to do is to do referrals, probably. And you'll pay all your license fees. You have to do all your continuing education, but you don't have to. You won't belong to the MLS. You won't be a Realtor member, probably of NAR, that kind of thing. So your fees go from being $1,200, $1,500 a year minimum to being $200, $300 a year minimum. And but your license is active. And so then in 2, 3, 4 years, when you're out from underneath whatever your other responsibilities are, you can just move your license to an active brokerage firm, if you will. It's probably not a good term, but and then start listing and selling. Great.
You said wait until next year to pass the state licensing exam.
Well, I just want to point out, remember that post-license education. So the question here is regarding waiting, right? That's what we're talking about. So you have, within your first renewal period, you have to take 30 hours of post-license education renewal, which you can take here or you can take at any pre-licensed school. I'd love to have you come back here, but we have limited offerings, so choose accordingly. And that your license renewal is April 30th, 2016. So the state will issue a date. It'll always be like March 1st or a little bit before or a little bit after, but they will say anybody licensed before March 1st is required to do the post-license education. Anybody who got licensed after March 1st isn't required to do their post-license education until 2 years from now. So if you are wanting to get started when the class is over, go get started and do it now, but you'll have to do your post-license education and have it all done before April 30th of 2016. So if you haven't gotten licensed yet and it's January or February, that's when I'm saying just wait. Don't get signed up there until after the March 1st deadline, because you'll save yourself the rush of trying to figure out, oh my God, where am I going to do this post-license education? Plus, the closer to the deadline, the license renewal deadline you get, the less time you've practiced, the less time you will have forgotten this material. The post-license education has less value, right? I mean, so like when I'm teaching this coming fall, I'm going to be telling everybody in that class, wait until after March 1st to get licensed, because you'll take this class, you'll go take the test in January, you'll get signed up, and you'll immediately have to do post-license education. Doesn't make a lot of sense, in that time frame. But for you guys, make it based upon, if you're going to get in the business, you're going to do it anyway. Get in the business and start listing and selling if that's your goal. Don't wait just because I'm pointing out that anomaly in the education process.
How much is it after that again? How many hours a year?
The CE is 6 hours per year,
Oh.
12 hours per
So
renewal
it's only
period.
30 the first year.
Correct.
And then after that, it's just 60.
Yep, unless you get a managing broker license, but that's a whole different matter. So my CE this year was, I had 12 hours of broker management and 12 hours of CE, so I had 24 because I would take a broker management class. But that's a whole different license class. If you never become a managing broker, which isn't worth it unless you're going to manage or own your own shop, then the CE will only ever be 6 hours a year. Any other questions? Okay, now let's get on with this last chapter, which is in some ways a summation. We'll probably run right to the end here to get through the material. So we're really talking about closing the transaction. Again, if you don't have these slides, I just put them up this afternoon. So I just took some information out of the chapter and some other terms that I've heard and threw it up here. Closing is sometimes called closing escrow, passing paper, settlement and transfer, and what it is really when the buyer and the seller or their agents or attorneys or whomever get together and close the deal. Settle a transaction. Buyer pays the money, seller receives the money, buyer gets title. That's what's happening at closing. It's really what that final sort of culminating event. So everything we've done in a real estate transaction, if it's a sale transaction, leads up to this real estate closing. The exception to that is in a land contract when you don't really have a closing because the seller continues to retain legal title. So, important thing to remember as you think about a closing, there's actually two transactions, hence my bullet points at the bottom. You're closing two transactions typically. You're closing a loan and you're closing the sale. If it's a cash sale, then there's no loan to close. Right? So there's really two deals happening at once at the typical real estate transaction. The loan and the sale. So part of what's in this chapter refers to the loan closing, part of it refers to the sale, part of it might refer to both. All right, so we have the two parties, the buyer and the seller. The buyer wants to make sure that everything is right, of course. So the buyer's main issue when they're preparing for closing is, can the seller convey marketable title? Back from chapter 13. Right? So there's an initial title search that's done when the property is either first listed or when it first goes under contract. And there's also going to be a final review. In fact, some title companies do what they call now a final bring down or final takedown after the closing, and instead rely on affidavits signed by the buyer and the seller at closing that we haven't done anything since the initial title search to screw up the title. Because, right, you do a search and then it closes, what, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks later? How do you know that all kinds of stuff hasn't happened to the title in the meantime? So part of what happens is at the closing, it's the last chance, or leading up to the closing, it's the last chance really for the attorneys to make sure that all this title work is right. We'll talk a little more about the title insurance part of it in just a minute. The final walkthrough is something you're very much involved in, particularly if you're the buyer's agent. Call it the final inspection, but really around here, everybody just calls it the final walkthrough. And it's not an inspection in the sense that there's no inspector, like a home inspection we would have talked about earlier in the course. It's you as the buyer's agent and the buyers. And you want to schedule this as close to the closing as possible, because when you sit down at the closing and you sign all the papers, you're taking the property in whatever condition it's in at that moment in time. So you don't do the final walkthrough a week ahead. Because if the house burns down and you go to the closing and buy it anyway, you've bought a heap of rubble. You don't want that mess. So if it's a 9 a.m. closing, you do the final walkthrough at 7:30 or 8 o'clock. You might do the final walkthrough the night before, but I try and avoid even that. I want to see it and go right from the closing, right from the walkthrough, right to the closing, and have the best sense that everything is the way it's supposed to be. So this is the opportunity where you get to make sure that everything is in the condition that it's supposed to be in. Is the house broom clean? Has all the garbage been removed? Did the pool table really get taken out of the basement? Was the inspection done properly? Did they put the did they take the refrigerator from the garage, like they said, and put it in the kitchen and take the refrigerator from the kitchen off to their next place? Whatever it might be, is the property in the proper condition? That's when you find out. And if it's not, this is where you really need to be quick on your feet as a buyer's agent. You need to immediately call the listing agent and say, we have a problem, and you need to call your buyer's attorney, hopefully they have an attorney, and say, here are the issues that should come up at the closing table. Remember that inspection issue to fix that light fixture in the basement? It's still the same way. You're going to have to also decide what's it worth, because now you're going to be negotiating for credit. We thought they were leaving the blinds in the in the bedrooms. The blinds are all gone. What do you think it's worth? Because now you're going to be trying to negotiate a credit. So that's the kind of thing that can come up at this final walkthrough. Most walkthroughs are harmless or meaningless, but very common and minor issues are things like, why are there 20 bags of garbage in the garage? Oh, we forgot. Here's the garbage stickers. Garbage isn't picked up until Thursday. And then that kind of thing. And then the parties usually go, oh, okay, sure, we'll be happy to cart the garbage out when it's garbage day. Things like that happen. So make sure you know how to deal with it. Be friendly, be tactful, but be proactive to get those things dealt with. And I'm going to tell you here at the real estate closing that you are not driving what happens. Really, once the property is under contract, you are not driving that deal. The attorneys are. But what you have to remember is that the attorney doesn't know the business deal as well as you do. The attorney doesn't know what the cracked tile in the shower is worth to replace or repair. So you have to stay actively involved to make sure these things get worked out. But let the attorneys and the lender and whomever else, the closer, kind of do their job as part of that transaction. Surveys aren't usually ordered until about 5 or so days before the closing, because we wait until everything else is in place before we have the survey crew come out. Title insurance companies like to inspect the property to make sure that they know what they're insuring the title of. But on a deal that seems pretty straightforward, like a residential deal where they're getting a current survey, and everything looks appropriate, they're not expecting any unrecorded easements or other things that could cause problems for a title insurance company, then that survey might be all that they look for. But the survey is mostly for the benefit of the buyer and their title insurer and the lender. So a contract that just leaves the survey open-ended, that's going to be the buyer's problem, because when the buyer purchases the property contingent upon financing, they're going to need a survey to get financing. So around here, the typical multi-board contract that you saw earlier in the text, and that we'll cover again in Real Estate 105, requires the seller to provide the survey. It hasn't always been the case over the years, but it is today, because if the contract doesn't make the seller provide it, the seller doesn't need a survey. It's the buyer or the buyer's lender and the title insurance company who won't close unless there's a survey on the property. Seller, what does the seller want? They want their money and they want to get out. Of all the documents that get signed at closing, the buyer usually has far more papers to sign, and most of those are related to the loan. The loan docs are the most complicated and thickest package at the closing. The sellers theoretically don't even have to show up. Sellers could pre-sign, give power of attorney to their attorney, and leave, and not be there. Buyers can't do that. A buyer typically must show up at the closing. If a buyer is not going to show up at closing, they usually will have to get a power of attorney approved a week in advance by their lender. Lenders on residential deals are a little nervous when their buyers, who are going to be owner occupants, don't even show up to the closing. That's not what they're expecting. So as a buyer, you have to expect to attend. As a seller, not really necessary, and there's not a lot of papers to sign. All right, so the title, getting back to the title insurance, that assures us we're going to have marketable title in Illinois and in most cases around the country. That final title insurance review is going to say, what's the coverage that we're getting? Do we have everything we need? Is the buyer happy? More importantly, is the buyer's lender happy with the coverage they're going to get? And what are the exceptions? There's a schedule of exceptions in a title insurance policy that you don't have to know the details of, but it's important, because if something is listed on that schedule of exceptions that's a problem for the lender or that's a problem for the buyer, then you're not going to be able to close. As I mentioned earlier, the parties, both, I think buyers and sellers today, are asked to sign affidavits that they did nothing to impair title. This is so that the title insurance company doesn't have to run down to the public records or look at their own title plan 2 hours before closing to make sure that they have the latest possible records. They take that initial search and they just have the buyer and the seller both swear that nothing has happened. They can do their own inspection, they have a survey, that combination is probably adequate. Then after the closing, the title company will go and triple check the records. And if there is a problem, there's a good chance that it was something the buyer or the seller caused, then the title company is off the hook and doesn't have to pay for that problem with the title. Lots of disclosures and affidavits and other kinds of documents that get signed at the closing. That's a big chunk of what happens there, just constantly signing and initialing papers. Closings, I think today, I don't know what they take on average, maybe 90 minutes. I can remember a lot of 30-minute closings when I first got into the business. There's just a lot more stuff to sign today. Things are more complicated. And closers and title companies, I think, are handling multiple transactions. So getting to the closing itself, the closing statement, the initial closing statement, whether it's a commercial deal and it's the title company's own form, or whether it's a residential deal and the rest of it mandates the HUD-1, the initial closing statement will probably be done by the seller's attorney with input from the lender, with input from the agents. So as the listing agent, you're the only one who knows what the commission is on the deal. So when a property goes to contract, you need to send that listing commission information to the seller's attorney. Here's how much our office is owed, here's how much the other office is owed, so that the commission can be cut in 2 checks at closing. Referral fees you can handle outside, that can be done later. But a buyer's agent should not have to wait nor trudge over to the listing agent's office to get their check. So that should all be done at the closing. So that's part of the information that you provide as a real estate agent for the closing statement. You're the only one who knows what that deal is. Provide that days in advance or weeks in advance to the seller's attorney. The lender has to provide all the information regarding their costs. The buyer will have a good faith estimate, as we'll see in a minute, but the lender ultimately is the one who's going to say, here are the charges, because the lender could waive or reduce some of those charges, and some of the things on the good faith estimate won't have been exact. They'll be within 10% or whatever the law requires. So again, some of those things you might know, like what some of the inspection fees were or something like that. So it takes input from multiple parties to make that, to get that information there. And the settlement statement is oftentimes revised at closing. Something nominally changes. We negotiated a $100 credit. We're going to handle the taxes differently. We're doing this or that or the other thing. So it can change. And sometimes even the math doesn't add up, numbers input wrong. That stuff oftentimes gets changed at closing. You should review a copy of the closing statement at the closing table to make sure your client's side of the business deal matches what you were expecting. Commercial transactions, I just listed it here because the HUD 1 is only required on 1 to 4 unit properties, and again, only if it's a loan, not a cash deal. So if RESPA doesn't apply to the transaction, particularly again to the loan side of the transaction, a title company can use any closing statement they want. And I've seen the closing statements that come from places like Chicago Title for non-residential deals, and they can be hard to follow if you're not used to seeing them. I've had accountants given information from a transaction who later had to come back to me and said, I don't understand what this is. I don't even understand what I'm looking at because it's not a standard format. Where with the beauty of the HUD 1 statement is, or any other standardized settlement statement, it's the same on every transaction. Everybody knows where to go to find certain information. So again, it depends upon what you do as to how easy or how complicated it is to follow a closing statement. And I think that's in the process of being changed. There are either a rule proposal or law proposal that the closing statement might be altered going forward. So look for that, not on your exams, but look for that when you're in practice, something other than the HUD 1. The closing itself can be done a couple of different ways. I put these other terms up here. New York style closing is what we do here. Face-to-face closing, where everybody sits down at the table together. At a minimum, both parties and their attorneys and their agents are invited. Again, sellers might not show up, buyers might not have attorneys, agents don't necessarily have to go, though I'll talk in a minute about why that's important. But also, again, referred to as a New York style closing because that's what they've done on the East Coast for years, and that's what we do here. Everybody present at the table. The closing it's not really conducted by, but there's a closing agent or officer. Today, the norm is that it's an employee of the title insurance company. And he or she who's ever sitting there is kind of making sure all the papers are right, to make sure that what the lender needs is all taken care of, and list, and they check everything else off. Do we have the survey? Do we have the initials on this? Do we have the deed? All this kind of thing. And they're printing copies of the closing statement, handing them out to the parties. Does everything look right? So that's how it's done today. It doesn't have to be done by a title insurance company. It used to be done by lenders more years ago. Lenders decided, why are we in the title, in the closing business? We're really not in it. Let the title companies do that. And then, of course, part of that is just exchanging all the documents and papers and money and everything else that happens during that time. The other way to close a transaction that's fairly common is to close in escrow, where the parties never meet each other at all. Nobody even sits down in the same building at the same time. And this is common on the West Coast, hence it's referred to as a California-style closing, where all of the required documents, like the loan documents and the title and the money and the easements and whatever else you need, the surveys, everything is all handed off to an escrow officer, an escrow agent, whose their job is to just keep looking, and they're missing something, they pick up the phone, they call somebody. And this process to close an escrow could take 3 days or even longer because there's no rush. Everybody doesn't show up at Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock and you're trying to get them out the door by 3 or 3:30 because you've got another group of people coming in. So it can take a long time to do. And then anything that's missing, they just pick up the phone, they call whoever they need it from, and they get the paper. And once all the papers are there, then the parties are notified, okay, it's done. We took care of the closing. But again, it's all sort of done at the escrow agent's office. Now, closings in some other states can actually be run by real estate brokers. Can't do that in Illinois because of the Quinlan and Tyson versus Chicago Bar Association case from the 60s. So real estate brokers are relegated to this sort of back room, role once the thing's under contract, because the attorneys have to take the lead. Some of the work that's done on title is legal work. It's either done by the attorneys or it's done by a staff attorney member for the title insurance company themselves, or it's done by staff members of the lender who's doing legal work for their own selves as they prepare or modify their own loan documents. So again, depending upon where you end up practicing, if you get licensed here and move somewhere else, you may find that you take a more active role in the closing process. Here, some brokers do very little, and some do quite a bit. Depends upon how involved you want to get or your office wants to get. All right, just really briefly, the 1099-S they referred to in the chapter is only part of the stuff that comes out of tax law, but I just want to point out a couple of things. You know, this information is reported. You, as an agent, will probably not get a 1099 if you're like me and you're completely independent. So I closed, gosh, what was it, last year? No, in 2013, the worst year I had for this, I closed 45. Yeah, I think I guess I've had a couple of years where I closed $50,000 to $60,000 worth of commissions and got no 1099 from anybody. And then I have to sit there and wonder, well, I got no tax form. I have to have remembered that. I have to have kept track of the income I got, and it gets reported slightly differently on your Schedule C on a line that says income for which I have no 1099. And that's different than getting a 1099 from an employer that says, we paid you $12,000 this year. So that happens sometimes because, you know, the average home seller, they don't prepare 1099s for their real estate agents. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that can happen. Most of my income today comes through a business, and so I get 1099s for lease commissions and things. But like when I sold the apartment building in 2013, that was some $25,000 something, no 1099 for that. You can't forget to report that on your income tax the next year. So you have to keep track of your own income. The seller in Illinois, right, is giving a property tax credit to the buyer because the seller will have lived in the property for a while without having to pay the taxes because we're so far in arrears. So that property tax money that the seller is paying to the buyer is part of what gets reported to the IRS because that's the seller's tax-deductible real estate expense. Even though the check gets made to the county from the buyer later, the buyer has to be aware that when they pay the taxes the next year, that's not all deductible. Only the portion that relates to when they lived in the house or the portion they paid minus whatever the seller gave them as a credit is actually an income tax deduction. So if you think about it at closing, you can kind of clarify that between the parties. It may take you a little while to actually understand that fully. I don't think it's something we get tested on, but it does matter for that purpose. And sellers have to be aware that, hey, if you have a gain on this house, you've got to report that sale of your house on your tax form, and then you can take the exclusion, but don't forget it, because again, this transaction is reported to the IRS. You don't want to get audited for something you weren't going to pay taxes on in the first place. So there are a couple of income tax issues that relate to reporting and closing. I do not have it here, but I wanted to point out, I can't remember exactly how it works, but investment property or property over a certain dollar amount, whatever, you have to prove that, provide evidence that there is nobody in the, or an affidavit or something, there's nobody in the buyer's group that constitutes a foreign entity. So like back to this apartment building that I closed in Naperville for $1 million in 2013, the buyers were family members, all family members. Maybe they had an LLC or something, I don't remember what they set up. But they had to provide some kind of evidence of where the money came from, their cash money came from, in addition to the loan, and sign an affidavit that they were all tax-paying entities. Because, you know, the IRS is trying to make sure that somebody isn't making a gain on U.S. real estate who then can't be taxed because they don't have a U.S. taxpayer ID number. So again, if you get into large-scale investment properties, there's more tax issues that will show up here. There's exchanges and all kinds of things that change the closing totally. Plus, a lot of commercial deals are closed with nobody present. All right, so what role will you play as a real estate broker at closing? Let's just think about this for a minute. What's the single most important reason why you would go to a real estate closing?
Make sure they're getting paid.
Yeah, that would seem right, but that's not the case. The number one reason you go to the closing is because you have this long-term relationship with your clients. And even the most sophisticated client doesn't necessarily buy and sell a house every 6 months or a year or 2 years. I've had clients who were in the real estate business who didn't know what to expect at the real estate closing because they hadn't really been on that position themselves as a home buyer or a home seller. So you're there to hold their hand, to walk them through it, to answer the questions. More importantly than that, that's really the second reason. The single most important reason you are there is not to get paid. Still, that's actually the third most important reason. The single most important reason you are there is because this is the last best chance you have to ask for repeat or referral business, to thank them for being your client, to hand them a half a dozen business cards or whatever you think is appropriate, and say to them, if you have any friends, family, coworkers, or if you're thinking about buying an investment property, or you're thinking about buying a condo for your kid when they go off to college, contact me. I can either help you or refer you to an agent who can. If you like the service I provided, please think of me. Repeat referrals, repeat business and referrals are important to me. And then you keep track of these people, because every business, not just real estate business, every business looks for repeat and referral business. It's expensive to create new customers. It's much cheaper to build upon the ones you have. So please don't underestimate that. It's extremely important that you go to closings to maintain that relationship and build on it in the future. Number 2 reason, hold their hand. Finally, you've said it several times, number 3 reason, get paid, take the money back to the office, hand that check off to the broker, let them deposit it so you can get paid hopefully within 24 hours, get your piece of the commission. Some brokers will trade you checks. They'll already have yours cut. As long as the closing, you call them from the closing, closed as expected, closed at a slightly reduced amount, here's our commission amount. They might even cut that check for you and hand it to you when you walk into the office an hour later or the next morning or whatever it is. But get them their money quickly and they'll get you their money quickly. If you're not getting your commission dollars promptly from your broker, you should look at that, because that's a big deal. I helped a brokerage firm one time that hadn't paid some commissions in a year. And I made them correct it right there on the spot. If you really want my assistance, the first thing you're going to do is come up with the money to pay these people. They were leasing commissions, not sale commissions, but these people were entitled to the money. I'm not helping you unless you fix that right now and fix that policy. They were treating them like they were some unneeded or unwanted vendors, and they figured as long as they kept paying them their salaries, they wouldn't worry about their commission bonuses. It was not acceptable. Yeah, so know why you're there, do the best job you can. Some agents, by the way, will also show up, help their, after closing and help their buyers move in, or at least bring them pizza or whatever. You got to decide what you want to do for housewarming gifts for clients. Today I just write a check. I tell people I don't do potted plants. So, that's how I handle that. But you could do a gift card or anything else. Housewarming gifts are normal, and they're usually presented at a closing, but some agents will come back as people are moving in and present them with something at that point in time.
So it's okay to do that in the housewarming party?
Yeah, you can do anything like that. Remember? Yeah, so we talked about the fact that all compensation in a real estate transaction has to go through a sponsoring broker and has to be paid to a licensee. There's an exception to that, which is the principal to the transaction. So your buyer, let's say that it's your twin sister, and you don't want to make any money on the deal, but the commission's got to come in. You could give to her every penny you make on the deal. That's perfectly acceptable. So you can pay a principal to the transaction, referral fees, commissions, rebates, whatever you want to do. Buyer agency rebates are common. Some brokerage firms to develop new business, some brokers will say to buyers, if I list your house and you buy with me, and if I sell your house and list and you buy with me, I'll give you back 1% of the buyer commission or whatever, because you're trying to entice them to get that business and stick with you. So that part's perfectly legal, again, as long as the money's being paid to a non-licensee who's a principal to the transaction. And that's all better it's defined. It doesn't have to be the principal, just a principal to the transaction.
So is it pretty standard, rebating?
No, it's not very standard, but it does happen. And I don't particularly like it because it thins what resources all agents have, because if I'm rebating, because that's how I want to generate my business, and then you talk to the same buyers and say, well, what do you give me if I'm your client? All of a sudden that changes the landscape, and by starting a kind of an avalanche, we're all giving money away, right? And you have to be a little bit careful about putting your product or service on sale. That's, choose that how you want. But Zip Realty was one that did that. I think Redfin has or somebody else has a similar model. I'm not real sure, but anyway.
So when you give a housewarming gift, do you do based on a percentage of the sale, or do you just come out of what's from the goodness of your heart?
I never had a rule of thumb. I was thinking about that as I said it. I hope nobody asks me how much is the typical housewarming gift.
How much you like the people?
Yeah, so the last deal I did for friends, and I wrote them a check for $500. If you do that, I'll come beat you up. Don't give away your money like that. Give them, a $50 gift card or a $25 fruit basket or something. You figure out what makes sense for you. And again, I wouldn't even recommend you do it, because I don't recommend to businesses that you give money away after you've done business with somebody. It's more important really that you stay with them. You take them out to dinner once a year, that you email them, that you send them flowers when they're sick, that you send them birthday cards, But there's a culture and a tradition of a housewarming gift. I've never seen such a thing. There's no parallel in commercial real estate that I'm aware of. But, so I just, recommend it, but I don't know. I mean, I have no idea. Again, I'm only doing business with friends and family at this point in time, so I always feel like I'm doing them a favor and trying to help them, so I'm giving them something for that reason. Now, if one of my daughters was trying to decide what she was gonna rent or lease, I promised her a specific, dollar amount out of the commission. I said, I'm still gonna do some work. And I said, but I'll give you X. That was my incentive to her, that kind of tied it back, but, it's not a $25 kind of decision, but.
So you would feel,
Yeah.
this is Cliff's standard for that.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, I mean, if you're doing all $150,000 townhomes, for example, then whatever you settle on, $50 would be the same that you give to everybody, right? But if all of a sudden you close a $1 million house, a $50 gift card to Home Depot might not, be really impressive, right? So you just have to look at it.
And my sister just sold her house, and it sold like 3 days after they listed it. And so her gal, who was my friend, I recommended it, gave her $1,000 back because she said she didn't have to spend any money on advertising.
Perfect. See, that then becomes your advertising, right? Because to give that money back,
She's
that's,
already recommended her twice.
see, and that's what you're looking for. So
Right.
I had a commercial deal, a little bit different, but I had a broker that worked for me when I was sponsoring a commercial firm that called me an hour before closing on a Walgreens site. This was on a Walgreens location up in Huntley. And we were expecting the commission for this vacant land site to be $144,000. We were the only broker involved. We were on the listing side of the transaction, and that was the deal. So the listing broker calls me up an hour before the closing and says, ran the closing numbers by the seller, and he says based upon his interpretation of the contract, they only owe us half the fee. Now here I am, managing broker of an office, and I have to make a $72,000 decision in like 30 seconds or whatever it was. Maybe it was actually even at the closing. So I sat there and thought about it. I thought, great, this $70-some thousand question on this firm. I don't have the contract in front of me. I don't know, what to say to the guy. So I said, well, let me ask you a question. Forget about what the contract says and all that legal interpretation. What's your goal with this client? He said, well, I got other listings with him. I said, are you going to represent him on other stuff? I hope to. I said, well, then what's the $72,000 worth to you? Because part of that is yours. Well, I'd rather keep him as a client than, go to war with him on this one fee. Think about that, $72,000. And they did other business with that particular client. I did a fair amount of real estate development. I don't know, I never did a study. I left the firm about a year and a half later. I never did a study to see, how much of it did it really make sense. But that's a legitimate business decision, right? I mean, what's this client worth to me? What's this relationship worth to me? And that really should probably be the right answer to Kate's question about the gift card, gift certificate, or housewarming gift. What's that client and what potential business they may steer your way worth to you? Because again, you're in business, so figure it out that way, I guess. All right, so back to the idea of the closing. The lender has an interest in the closing. Lenders don't typically show up, although they might. You can have a loan officer show up at the closing. Where the lender is really represented is through the packages that they've traded with the closing officer or the brokers or the attorneys, typically with the closing officer, that'll say, you can't fund the loan or you can't fund the deal until make sure that this, and this is in place. Or if it's a closing where everything is already there, the lender may say, yeah, you're good to go. You just make sure this stuff is there and then go ahead and fund. Here's the funding number, or here's whatever you need to have the access to the money. But they're concerned, of course, about being in first place or the appropriate location in the priority, in the chain of priority. They want to make sure that marketable title was obtained as well, because that title is eventually potentially the collateral that they're going to get when the borrower fails to pay in future years. And they want to make sure that there aren't any encroachments or other encumbrances, easements, or other things that they're not aware of that would affect the functional utility of the property. So these are some of the things that the lender is looking at. Lenders can have more concerns than that. The worst thing that ever happened to me at a closing regarding a lender deal was that I don't think I told you guys this story, was where the lender discovered between the time that they approved the deal that the couple who they were loaning to had been separated, like, I don't know, 8 years earlier. And when they were separated, she got a judgment against him for child support. Now they're back together. They never divorced, and they were back living together. They were buying this property together. And so all of a sudden, at closing, not in the lending package, nothing that came days in advance, but at closing, the lender's like, hey, we need them to sign off. We need, both of them to sign a statement that this is taken care of. So we took care of that, and 30 minutes go by, and we're all sitting around waiting for things, and this was like 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, and the word comes back that they need it signed off on also by the Illinois Department of Public Aid. And I turned to everybody at the table and I said, they're closed. They closed at 4 o'clock. The people look at me like, how do you know that? I said, they're tenants in my building. They close at 4 o'clock every day. So we couldn't close the deal. My sellers were an estate, so the house was empty and they had ongoing real estate taxes but no loan or whatever. Those buyers and their mortgage broker were so frustrated with that lender that they didn't close for a month. They went out and got a new lender and paid an entire month's worth of real estate property taxes and other carrying, whatever they agreed to with my seller, the cost for my seller to have to wait because they were so frustrated with a lender that that came up with something at the last minute that was kind of meaningless. A couple that were married, they could have determined that weeks in advance. So that's the worst kind of thing I've ever seen happen when a lender kind of almost kill a deal at the closing. Usually lenders are well out in advance, they know what they need, it's just a matter of getting everybody to sign off and you're good to go. Anyway, so this statute here is probably good to know. I don't know if you get test questions like this at the state exam, but in practice, it's important that these deadlines get met. So when the lender under RESPA provides Truth in Lending is under the Truth in Lending Act and provides a good faith estimate to the borrower, they have to do that within 3 days from the time that the loan application is finalized, includes when the fees are paid or whatever. So within 3 days. If the lender doesn't do that, they've failed their duties under RESPA and Truth in Lending, Regulation Z. Ahead of signing the loan document at the closing, right, any final or modified Truth in Lending statement and good faith estimate have been provided to the borrower as well. Borrowers have the right to know what are we paying at closing. Because at closing, you're going to have this good faith estimate there. The most recent current one, you're going to compare it to the loan charges on the closing statement to make sure that they're right. A lender has no right to charge fees that weren't disclosed under a good faith estimate unless it's the type of loan that's not covered by these, like by RESPA, for example. It's a commercial deal or something like that. There's some interesting litigation on that I won't go into here, but yeah, there's been many cases where lenders on complex deals change the financing terms at the last minute. Can't do that on residential because of laws protecting consumers. But in non-residential deals, that's a possibility. And it's a tough decision to make sometimes. You get up and walk from the closing table and you have the obligation to close, but your lender's trying to hose you for something you never saw coming. And then if at the last minute, say you lose your outside your lock period and the interest rate changes, if that rate changes more than 1/8%, the closing's got to be delayed at least 3 days. You can't close unless that is disclosed and the borrower has a chance to think about it. Because they could walk from their fees, whatever, if there's a breakup fee or cancellation fee or whatever. I don't know, lenders even charge those? I don't know if they charge them on residential deals. Commercial deals you do. Commercial deals you pay a loan commitment fee, and if you decide not to close, the lender gets to keep the loan commitment money. Usually just the application fee on a residential deal. But if things change enough, business deal changes, you might not have to close. All right, so just throw that up there. RESPA, this is pretty important stuff to understand. RESPA is probably the most significant financing-related legislation you'll see regarding real estate until or unless we start getting new regs from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. RESPA is something that affects most residential real estate transactions, and you'll get this in continuing ed classes and other sorts of things. So, first of all, what does it apply to? Residential real estate loans that are federally related. So what does it mean to be federally related? Almost all loans. Just leave it at that. I mean, it's a state bank is still going to be considered a federally related loan. FHA involved, HUD involved, loans over, a lender of any kind who loans over a certain dollar amount going to be considered federally related. Residential, 1, 2, 3, or 4 units. So a 5-unit property, RESPA doesn't apply to. So RESPA requires things like that good faith estimate we were just talking about. I closed a 5-unit property in Joliet many years ago, same family I mentioned to you earlier, and the buyers came to the closing table and their attorney was asking them, well, where's your good faith estimate so I can compare it to the closing statement? They said, we never got one. And the attorney said, well, I can't believe the lender didn't give you one. They have to give you one. They had this 5-minute conversation, and finally I turned to both the attorney and the buyer and I said, don't you realize this is a 5-unit building? They were like, yeah. I said, RESPA doesn't apply. The lender didn't have to give you anything. Oh. You know, I was surprised that the attorney didn't understand that that was the case. So they literally didn't know how much cash they had to have at the closing. They never asked the lender, just thought a good faith estimate would show up, and the borrower had to leave and go to their bank and come back with a bigger cashier's check to be able to close the deal. They were just guessing. Good faith estimate solves that problem, but again, on a 5-unit, it's not required, or any non-residential transaction. Obviously, cash transactions are exempt because there's no loan involved. It's not the sale that's being regulated here, it's the loan transaction. There are some other exemptions in the book that I wouldn't worry about. If you want to learn them, that's great. I actually don't know what they are. RESPA identifies certain activities that are allowed and certain activities that are not allowed. So first of all, let me define something I don't know that's really given here. It's settlement service provider. A settlement service provider is any entity that's listed on or paid on the closing statement, such as a lender, an attorney, a title insurance company, real estate agents, inspectors, that kind of thing. Those are settlement service providers. So if you're paid off the closing statement as a settlement service provider, you may not pay kickbacks or referral fees unless it's specifically allowed under RESPA and or if it's disclosed. So, for example, an illegal kickback or referral fee between settlement service providers would be if the mortgage lender said, hey, thanks for the referral for referring these people to us, here's $50. Can't do that, it's a violation of RESPA. If the attorney said, hey, thanks for bringing us a client, here's a $10 gift card to Carrabba Grill or whatever, can't do that, it's a RESPA violation. Referral fees that are allowed, real estate brokers paying referral fees to other real estate brokers, specifically allowed under RESPA. Title insurance company commissions to attorneys who bring title company business, specifically allowed but must be disclosed. The controlled business arrangements that they talk about, I think I have it, here it's here, they talk about it in the book, so like you own part of a mortgage brokerage firm, perfectly allowed but has to be disclosed. And as I mentioned earlier, you can be the mortgage loan originator and the real estate agent on the same transaction, but it has to be disclosed and signed off on. That's perfectly acceptable. But otherwise, if it didn't mention those things, then mostly RESPA is trying to get rid of these things. The whole goal of RESPA is to streamline, simplify, and make less expensive the residential real estate loan and sale closing process. So no hidden fees, no hidden costs, right? If every mortgage broker or every attorney or every pest inspection company was willing to kick back a little money to the real estate agents or vice versa to conduct business, what would have to happen to the fees that are charged? They would have to go up to cover them, and RESPA says that's hidden costs. So get rid of that to make it more transparent. Pardon my use of that overused word. So anyway, so that's what RESPA is really all about, trying to streamline that and make sure there's no actual extraneous expenses, etc. involved. Importance of the good faith estimate, as I mentioned probably earlier, including in the lending chapters, have your buyers give you a copy of their good faith estimate as soon as they get it. You can't help them determine how much cash they need to close on a deal if you don't know what fees are the lenders are charging. And the same lender won't charge the same fees on two deals in a row because they might have been different applications, might have been different risks, different kind of scenarios. So, across the wide range of lenders, every deal is going to be a little bit different. So make sure you get that so you can help them prepare. And then either they or you bring the most recent good faith estimate to the closing so it can be compared properly to the closing statement. If there are fees on the closing statement that shouldn't be there because they're not on the good faith estimate, then you can ask the buyer's attorney to contact the lender. If they don't have an attorney, either you or the closer can contact the lender and say, hey, here's the good faith estimate. You've got something on line 102 and there's nothing in the good faith estimate. What happened? They'll be obligated to remove it or say close it and we'll rebate the money later. Occasionally lenders will even catch those in their own reviews. Every once in a while have a buyer say to you, hey, I got a check for $25 back from so-and-so because they said they forgot to put the flood cert on my good faith estimate. Is that right or whatever? Lenders will sometimes pick that up themselves. You should catch that at the closing if you can. All right, so again, know the basics of RESPA. It's for closing loan transactions, not sales. It's gonna cover most residential loan deals, and it's gonna be, the good faith estimate that has to be provided within 3 days after the loan application is made is something you'll wanna work with. And it probably should have a basic idea of, the prohibition against kickbacks and referral fees, et cetera. And again, remember that fee is anything of value. So the kind of test question you could get at the state exam regarding RESPA, for example, is you have a friendly neighborhood mortgage broker who offers to host an open house for you and provide food for all of the people who come to your real estate agency open house. That could be a RESPA violation because they're providing you something of value that could be perceived to be a kickback. If it's a general kind of thing, they can probably do that. But if it's specific to a particular transaction, then they probably can't. Again, you just have to watch that kind of stuff. All right, basic idea of the closing statement of the HUD one. To be able to read it is a good idea. Again, we'll go over this and I'll give you an example of it in Real Estate 105 with some numbers filled in, I hope, when we have time. But, on the seller side of the transaction, we looked a little bit at this idea of a net to seller, and we'll actually do a net to seller calculation in Real Estate 105 where we go through and calculate those costs. It's good to be able to do the same stuff if you have a good faith estimate and be able to help the buyer determine how much cash they're going to need to close the deal. Because not only do they have to bring in the money for the purchase price, but they have to bring in enough cash for the points and the fees and any other costs that have to be paid by them off the closing statement, including prepaids that aren't really costs, but are being paid in advance, like the real estate tax escrow or the hazard or homeowner's insurance escrow. It's all got to be funded from somewhere. That's got to be funded out of the buyer's proceeds. So the buyer may say, great, I've got $150,000 in cash, I'll bring it to closing to close my $150,000 purchase. That may not be enough money to close the deal because you've still got other things that have to be paid in advance as part of that. Even if there's no lender fees, there's still other things that might be owed. In some states where taxes are paid in advance, the buyer might owe a credit to the seller for real estate taxes that the seller already paid when the buyer is going to be living in the house for the rest of the year. Whereas here, the seller is giving a credit to the buyer for real estate taxes because we pay them in arrears, and the seller has lived in the house without having paid all the taxes. Normally, on the closing statement, each party pays the costs that relate to them. So each party should pay their own attorney fees, for example. Broker's commission kind of depends. It's usually coming out of the seller side of the transaction, but we know, right, that the buyer could be paying a commission as part of a buyer agency deal. That would be listed there. Recording expenses. Let's see, what would the buyer pay to record? The mortgage, right? That's going to be theirs, and going to be paid to record the deed, because that's going to be for them. What's the seller going to pay in recording charges? The release. So, each party's going to have some recording expenses. Transfer taxes, that's going to be put on there. Who's paying them? Depends upon what community we're in. The seller should pay the state and county transfer taxes. That's taken right off the closing statement. If you're in a city like Bolingbrook where it's split, or Chicago where it's split, then both parties are going to have some transfer taxes on the municipal level. If it's in a city like Wheaton where it's all the buyer, you're going to have buyer municipal transfer tax with seller, state and county. Again, it depends upon where you are, but each party should pay their own. And then title expenses. Each party's got a portion of the title search that they're paying for. The closing itself, who's paying for that? There's a room, there's a closer. Customarily here, it's interesting to me that in a closing, the typical residential loan closing, the buyer's paying the closing fee. That's kind of backwards philosophically because buyers need to come up with cash and sellers are getting cash. So think about how we handle the real estate commission, which was one of the biggest expenses, right? Even though it's for both parties' benefits, the entire commission comes off the seller's side of the transaction. And as I may have pointed out earlier, I think all real estate values are roughly elevated equal to the amount of commissions that are paid, so that the buyer is in effect kind of paying that commission. But it all comes out of the seller's side because buyers don't want to have to come up with all that extra dollars. So here we are, when it comes to certain other expenses, we're asking the buyer to pay them instead of the seller, and that's true with the closing costs on residential deals. If you're talking about the cost for the closer in the room, the cost of actual closing, and all that stuff is usually split on commercial deals. Commercial deals, I see the parties agree in advance, we'll split that cost. But in residential, we make the buyer pay for whatever reason. The title insurance expenses, again, the seller will usually pay for part of the search, buyer for part of the search. Buyer pays for a lender's policy, seller pays for the owner's policy, which covers the buyer. So both parties have some title charges, same title company, two different policies issued at the same time. Yes? And-
So someone like me that I've never bought a house
Yeah.
or I don't know any of this, like attorney's fees,
Yeah.
broker's commissions, like about estimate, like on a normal, or average house, how much are you spending as a seller? on this
Well,
just-
maybe a couple percent, but that would include your transfer taxes, if you don't have municipal transfer tax. So right off the top of my head, without even thinking or looking at anything, if I were knowing I was gonna charge a 5% fee and the seller said, well, how much of that's gonna cut, how much of this am I gonna lose for all the costs of selling, I would tell them 7%. But I haven't done that very frequently recently, so I'd probably go back and recalculate it. And I'd have to think about the transfer tax, because transfer taxes in some places are 0.5% or a full percent. I wanna double check that first, but for just the municipal portion of it. But, what I suggest to you is that you ask to get copies of closing statements as soon as you go to broker, say, hey, can I see some recent closing statements? And then make photocopies of those and carry them with you. Because the closing statement becomes the template for your seller's net proceeds or your buyer's cash at closing when you sit with them, because you pull that out and you go, okay, a survey is $300, okay, the appraisal was $400. That became the way that I learned how to do that. Attorney's fees will range from $3 to $350 at the bottom end, up to maybe thousands for a seller in a short sale. So you also need to know what's the differentiating factor between one and the other. But this is where your sponsoring broker, or maybe even a trainer, if you work for a big enough firm, can help you when you get started to give you what you need to have tools in your briefcase to take with you. So the first time you sit down with a seller by yourself, you can sort of copy the information from the last closing or something else and say, okay, we're going to estimate $400 for an attorney. Could be more, might be a little less, but we'll just go with $400. And I would tend to estimate those conservatively. If I thought the average attorney fee today was $400, I would tell my seller $500, because I'd rather, be a little conservative on that number. If I think it's between 7 and 7.5% total, including commissions, I'd tell them 7.5. Right, because rather at the closing they have a few hundred extra or even a few thousand extra than have it go the other way. That's just the way I tend to look at business things in general. So again, you're not at any disadvantage currently to not know, what the recording expenses are. $20 here, $35 there. You're not going to get asked that anymore along the way until you're in practice and having to advise a client. Yeah, yeah.
Curious.
Yep. No, it's perfectly good question. It's a commonly asked question. All right, following on with closing statement, again, loan fees. You could have prepayment penalty charges that the seller's paying on their loan if they're paying at that. Otherwise, the loan fees are typically being paid by the buyer. Tax reserves, impound accounts, if anything, I mentioned that. The appraisal fee might actually be part of the lender application process. So you can end up with something that says POC on a closing statement. Closing statement is accounting form. You add the numbers up or you subtract the numbers, and it serves as your accounting. You have two sides. You have a seller's side and a buyer's or borrower's side. Actually, borrower's on the one side and on the left, and seller's on the right, if I remember correctly. But the appraisal fees have already been paid as part of the loan application process. So you don't want to forget it because you want to make sure it got taken care of. So they'll usually be off to the side of the closing statement. When Mandy went and applied for her loan, she paid us $295 for a credit check, background check, and appraisal fee. But then you put zero, or you put POC rather than zero, in the closing statement to point out that it was already paid outside of the closing. You'll see sometimes attorney's costs. Somebody will have an attorney that they've paid before the closing or something else. You'll see various other things can be marked in the closing statement as POC. Otherwise, it's a repository of all of the costs that are related to the closing that are going to be paid at the closing, or at the same with POC that were paid before or might even be paid immediately after. Anyway, so this is basically what it's for. The whole idea of the closing statement is it's expense accounting for the buyer and the seller. And it's debits and credits is this accounting term. So let me just put up on the board because I never really kind of got this whole thing finished. So when you're wondering sort of debit to whom, credit to whom, debits and credits on a closing statement are pretty straightforward. This is not your typical, financial or managerial, financial I guess would be better, accounting course. A debit is simply money leaving your pocket at a real estate closing. So I do it this way. Debit is on the left and credits are on the right, because if you're getting a credit, money is coming into your account or been paid on your behalf. A debit is anything that leaves your side of the table. So for a seller, for example, the sale price is a credit because that's money coming to them. But the money that on their side of the closing statement that pays off their existing loan is a debit, because right, the money sort of goes to them on the statement. Here's the purchase price, but down below it you still owe $46,000 to your lender. That's a debit because it's money now leaving their side of the table. On the buyer's side, their new loan is a credit. That new loan to a buyer is the same, works exactly the same way on a closing statement as if somebody came and dumped the cash in their lap. You're borrowing 150 grand, here you go. At the closing, it's money being paid on their behalf by their lender, right? But what do they do later? Every month from their checking account, it becomes a debit, right, as they pay that money back. But at the closing table, it's a credit. So there's a list in the book of debit to what's a debit, what's a credit. It's probably a good idea to understand that. But I draw myself in my head this simple little picture of money leaving me or leaving my side of the table is a debit, going this way, money is a credit. So you can look at it in part as money coming to me as a credit, or money leaving me as a debit, or working this way. If it's money going from one side of the table to the other, debit the seller on the real estate taxes and credit the buyer in the exact same amount. So that kind of thing is how that would work. We'll look at a proration example if we have time when we do the math review. I don't even remember if I have a proration question on the final for now. If we do, I'll go over that with you. So I wouldn't worry about that. But I do want to point out that there are a couple of different ways to do proration. There's this statutory month method, and this is common in finance. A banker's year is 12 months of 30 days. May seem odd because we know there's a 365-day year, but that's not the way finance is calculated. In many cases, because it's in the bank's favor and it's simpler, 12 months of 30 days. February has 30 days, July has 30 days, we don't care. 12 months, 30 days. I'm told by people that at the state exam, you're going to get the statutory month method. If you get a proration question, you would only get one. I'm told in practice by people who are closers that they tend to do 365-day years. But lenders will probably typically do 12 months of 30 days. It's the nature of the lending world. Accrued items are like our real estate taxes in Illinois, right? We pay them in arrears. So when I show up at a closing and I'm the seller, I owe the buyer money. So another quick diagram here up on the board. If you get a question about this, I recommend you draw yourself a picture, because you have a year or a month or whatever period of time you have. So let's just look at it this way. So let's just say that I have January 1 and I have December 31st on this other end. We could do this with a month for rent proration or anything else we want to do. But let's say we have a 1-year period. Somewhere in here, in a proration question, they're going to put a date in here or a time in here, and they're going to say whatever, like, July 31st. That's when we have the sale. So when you're figuring out debit to whom and credit to whom is relatively simple. Each party should have paid for the benefit they received. So looking at my little picture, who owns the house for the first 7 months here? The seller, right? Because the seller is there and they own it. Who's going to own it for the last 5 months of the year? The buyer. So the buyer should be paying for the last 5 months, and the seller should be paying for the first 7 months. This is how I remind myself of this. So anything that's accrued, in other words, the bill is due, it hasn't been paid, like our real estate taxes in Illinois, then the seller has not paid taxes for this 7-month period. He has to be debited for that period and pay that to the buyer at closing, because the buyer is going to get the bill next year and have to pay for all of his period plus the seller's portion. So when you're figuring this out, it's helpful to say, oh, okay, yeah, the seller is going to get debited for 7 months, and that same 7-month debit amount is going to get credited to the buyer, because the buyer's got to write that check to the taxing body the following year. The same thing would be true if it was homeowners association dues. Let's say the seller was really hard pressed and didn't have enough money to pay their association dues for the year, or for some reason they're collected at the end of the year. The seller would owe the buyer for 7 out of 12 months of the association dues if it's an annual fee, right? That would be an accrued item, something that is paid in arrears, paid after the fact. Prepaid items, you can get states where the taxes would be paid on January 1st for that year coming, in which case now the debit to whom, credit to whom flips on its head, right? Because now, if you have a prepaid item where the seller, for example, paid the homeowner's dues for the entire year, but ends up only living in the house for 7 months, it's the buyer who needs to be debited for the 5-month period to credit the seller for that, because the buyer is going to live in the home for that 5 months he didn't pay the association dues for, where the seller did. All right, so you're looking at two things here. Matching up the cost to the benefit, and then making sure you remember which period of the year we're talking about. So in an arrears situation, you're talking about the period that has already gone past. In an accrued scenario, it's here on the left. In an advance situation, you're talking about the period on the right because it's been paid for and shouldn't have been. Does that make sense? Yeah, in worst case scenario, you get one question on that kind of thing. I think you'll do well if you just really understand debit to whom, credit to whom, and who pays for what. I think that those are probably the principal things. As an agent, you won't have to calculate prorations very much. Maybe you'll get into that a little bit for taxes for net sheets, but even that's fairly simple. So that's the difference between accrued and prepaid items. It makes no difference if it's taxes or rent or what it is. It just matters, paid in advance, paid in arrears. Don't let the subject matter of that kind of question fool you. And I think that's probably enough of that. Let me see if I got anything else here that's worth. Yeah, that's probably enough. Any other questions about anything at all out of this chapter, or about the closing statements, or about prorations, or anything else?
So you said that the prorations, that's something that the, agent doesn't have to worry about?
Yeah, the only time you won't calculate prorations for closing statements. That'll be done by the closer, by the seller's attorney, by whomever's handling those documents. However, you might, for either a cash closing exercise or a seller net sheet, have to do prorations. And so, but you can do it fairly simply, because you can pick up any given day. You don't have to have it be in the middle of the month. You can just estimate, well, here's what your taxes would be, you would owe if you closed on May 1st, that kind of thing. And that's pretty simple, pretty straightforward to do. So I wouldn't worry about that for right now. Again, we're kind of running late. I don't want to throw a bunch of math up here. If you have a proration question, I'll go over that with you a week from tonight and show you exactly how it needs to be done for the final. I think I've removed that proration question from the final. I just don't remember too many versions of final exams floating around in my head. There are examples there in the book you can self-test on, or in the post module if you need to. Again, if you get a proration question at the state exam, you could only have one. That's all there would be. All right, so I owe you guys the test. Anybody who wants to hang around, I will. I'll just print that last quiz. I'll just see if there's enough paper in this printer. I have staplers. I have staples, and I can just print them here. Otherwise, I will post that unit test 4 up in the course shell, and you can download it as a PDF. The other should be enough paper here, you can download it from there and self-test. But if you want to hang around, I'll try and print those back there right now if I can do that. And any other questions you want to shoot at me in the meantime. Otherwise, it's, come ready to take notes on Thursday night, because we're going to be going over the whole thing.